Morning. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land upon which we meet today and to pay our respects to their elders past, present and to their emerging leaders. Not sure if you know, but WA is in Australia. Had to say that. Didn't see WA, didn't see Perth up there, but we are that little sort of western outlier of Australia. And in particular, I would just probably note as well that the Alliance, as a group of people who represent agencies across Australia, are committed to the one common agenda, which is ending homelessness in Australia. And I think that's the strength of the Alliance. The Alliance doesn't exist to be a body, it exists because it's driven by the same common agenda. So, and the connection with that in Perth in particular is, of course, that we started Registry Week, as you know, in the data that Felicity has shown, but really we've taken our great leadership from MICA, who really partnered Perth and RUAH Community Services, and RUAH is not an acronym. Actually, we were originated from the Daughters of Charity, and it actually means the breath of God. It's not an acronym, which is, I think, part of the issue when you lose language and narrative. So we had a lot of leadership from MICA in helping us do. So in 2015, we launched, after Registry Week, the 50 Lives, 50 Homes campaign without a single dollar of funding. And then the gracious Sisters of St John of God stepped in and funded us for $3 million to run a 3-year project. So we've just completed the first year. So like Karen and Felicity have referred to, it is a housing first approach, and we're very clear around the housing first approach as a solution to ending homelessness. And the speaker this morning talked about a home is a human right. It's not a basic right, it's a human right. And that's the premise from which we've launched 50 Lives, 50 Homes. It is a collective impact model, and I'll talk briefly about the research that is being conducted by the University of Western Australia and the Centre for Social Impact, that's doing a 3-year longitudinal research into the impact both for client outcomes in this approach, also the economic benefit, but also the strength of a partnership as a collective impact approach, and how does that approach deliver better integrated services in the service system of homelessness in Perth. And I'm delighted to say, so in the first year, the campaign has housed 43 people. So our target was 50 lives and 50 homes at the end of 3 years. At the end of 12 months, at the moment it says here we're 43 people and 34 houses. I have to put my glasses on to read this next bit. But in fact, as of last week, we're 77 people in 58 houses. Of those, of the people that have completed 1 year that were housed a year ago, we have a 91% retention rate, which we also work in the mental health space, we work in the family and domestic violence and justice space, and that level of retention is pretty unique. Having said that, it's only 1 year. Of the people that didn't maintain their tenancy, one person was an unsuccessful tenancy and the other person passed away. So again, we think the data is pretty compelling in that space. I think one of the game changers for us was, wrap up, the lady is telling me at the back, was the after hours service, which was funded through the old Medicare local, now called WAFA, Western Australian Primary Healthcare Alliance, which has provided 24-hour after-hour psychosocial and clinical nursing support, which really provides both, attends to people's physical needs, mental health needs and drug and alcohol needs. We've also addressed gaps in service provision. You know, for example, ID is a key issue for people who are experiencing homelessness, and have run mini labs in how we can facilitate people getting their ID addressed. As you can see there, 46 services from 30 organisations collaborate in the collective impact approach. Oops, sorry. And I'm mentioning Advance to Zero, am I? I'm quickly mentioning Advance to Zero, so here I go, I'm mentioning Advance to Zero. So obviously the Australian Alliance to End Homelessness is also committed to advancing to zero. Oops, you can tell I'm not tech savvy, as my 2 staff members in the room will attest to. It is a campaign to support local communities to do registry weeks using the VI SPDAT and to run a campaign to end homelessness in their own communities, which both of the girls have talked about today. It's not just about street homelessness, as Karen has talked about, but also about families and people moving in and out of the crisis arena. From May of this year, the Australian Alliance convened representatives from around Australia and Jake from the US to map out what a national campaign would look like in order to end homelessness. So far we've appointed and contributed a campaign director, and we have a work plan that's been established. The work plan addresses communication, shared data and core campaign roles. I think we've heard about, in terms of this morning, the collective goal, which is a national action of communities working to end homelessness. And the definition for us of success for one person or a family is ending rough sleeping for a single individual or family will be measured by placement into permanent housing. Defining success for the community, ending rough sleeping will mean that a number of people sleeping rough is less than the community's average monthly housing rate, and you heard that this morning. Am I going to keep talking to this? Is that enough? Because I'm sure it can't. Okay. Questions?
Yeah, questions? Given that homelessness is highly correlated with poverty, how can we possibly end homelessness without raising the New Start payment, which is at the moment 40% below the poverty line?
Do you want to go?
Well, people... Well, we support any campaign to raise New Start, but that's not the goal of the Alliance. But obviously it's not the only thing we do. But I mean, people are housed on New Start, and then we do have to do the work about mitigating against the impacts of poverty so people sustain their housing. We don't have enough affordable housing for people on New Start, and that's why most of the people on the streets of Brisbane are certainly New Start recipients. And with the breaching that's happening, that is also increasing the number. And they're the drivers into homelessness that we have to really address if we're going to end it. But, fully support the notion that New Start should be increased.
Another question from the floor. Have I got anything on Slido?
Sorry?
We have a Slido question here.
We've got a Slido question. Terrific. Right.
So to Karen Walsh and potentially Felicity and Heather, of the 4 housing options you mentioned, did you find one option more financially effective versus outcomes?
Well, different people will need different types of housing. And just in comment to that last question, I firmly believe that homelessness is not complex. I think it gets overthought, overcomplicated. Homelessness is ended with housing. However, it doesn't mean you've ended people's poverty, it doesn't mean you've solved their mental illness, it doesn't mean you've solved a whole range of things, but you have in fact solved their homelessness. And different people will require different types of housing, different types of support to sustain that housing. And I hope you'll all go, we'll all be hearing Cameron this afternoon, and I hope he might mention the very interesting cost study that he did in the evaluation of Brisbane Common Ground. It's the only one I'm aware of in Australia that used administrative data so effectively to point out the cost offsets for government in providing permanent supportive housing. Are you going to talk about that, Cameron?
I just think that social housing, whether it's managed by public housing authorities or community housing, is clearly the best option for many people because it's affordable, it's based on a percentage of their income. But I think we've got a long way to go to reclaim what social and public housing offers to our communities and to people. I just want to say that the Alliance started really out of a vision from the white paper, and it was 9 years ago, I think, that we were in Adelaide in this centre when that paper was released. And I think that, what we do in our local communities is one thing, what we do as a nation is another. And that paper gave some very good strategic directions that we just didn't follow. And it would be great if we could keep that vision alive, because it was a vision that we all feel that a lot of us felt passionate about, and we shouldn't let it go just because politicians don't talk about it.
One last question from the floor.
Has the Alliance noticed an increase in homelessness among single parents since the shifting of single parents from the New Start payment
Yes.
Look, sadly, time doesn't permit. There are great questions coming up on Slido. One says, are tent cities the best way to get the issue of homelessness noticed? You know, that's sort of a heartbreaking...
It was fabulous protest in Sydney. I was
Yeah.
cheering from the sidelines. I'm really sorry people are still street homeless, but the fact that the media picked up the very strong message that people were giving that we want permanent housing, not temporary solutions, was fantastic. The great shame to the New South Wales government was that within, half a day, a piece of legislation went through Parliament to criminalise what they were doing rather than to ensure that people got housed. That is just appalling.